Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about something that has been brewing for a while. It's been playing out on Twitter culturally and podcasts and politically. And this isn't just some random internet drama. This is a conflict that goes all the way back to the first century. What we're watching right now is a modern expression of a much older tension, and it's taking shape in the way it is because of massive factionalism on the left, particularly over the war in Gaza, which pushed a lot of Jews and Zionists, people who had historically been on the left, over to the right. And when they got there, they didn't just find generic conservatism, they found Catholics, particularly young men, including many Hispanic Catholics, many of whom had already been moving into the Republican Party as a result of Trump and the broader America First movement. That convergence brought together groups with very different worldviews, priorities, and frameworks. And that internal friction has been brewing both politically and culturally for the past few years. You even saw attempts to shape this dialectic from figures like James Lindsay, a former liberal who moved right during the woke era, who tried to frame Catholics as woke right, as if Catholicism itself is some new identitarian threat mirroring the excesses of the left. Lindsay was essentially running around like a headless chicken for several years, trying to convince people that Catholics are the next existential threat to Western civilization, that Catholic integralism is a new wokeism, and that it needs to be stopped before it takes hold of our institutions. But when you actually examine those claims, they're not rooted in substance, they're rooted in fear-mongering and narrative control. It comes across as a preemptive attempt to define and neutralize a group before it fully asserts itself in the post-MAGA political landscape, especially once figures like Trump are no longer the center of gravity. And I've seen this play out personally. I've been attacked by my own party viciously, and a lot of that pressure has come from what I've described in previous videos as the Jewish lobby, which includes individuals organizing Jewish activists within the party to go after myself and people who fit a similar profile based completely on baseless claims. The trigger for that wasn't anything extreme. It was myself and many others saying we need a broader coalition to win midterms. That's it. But what that revealed is something deeper, that while many in our party establishment claim to be pro-free speech, claim to be common sense, there are very clear boundaries. And one of those boundaries is that everyone involved has to have unconditional support for Israel and their conflicts. Step outside of that, even slightly, and suddenly you're a problem. Suddenly you're labeled, targeted, isolated for removal. And this is where it starts to spill out of internal party friction and into the broader cultural space because, as we all know, these kinds of tensions never stay contained. Once they build long enough, they get picked up, amplified, and reshaped, and that's when you get dishonest actors and propagandists stepping in to exploit it for their own political ends. And that's exactly what Laura Loomer has been doing. As we'll see in a moment, she's been tweeting incessantly about Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, while also going after several Catholic voices online who have been critical of the state of Israel and America's support for Israel's endless wars. And instead of engaging with any of those criticisms directly, she escalates it, shifting from attacking individuals to constructing a much broader narrative about Catholics as a whole. And from that framing, she is introducing and pushing a claim that Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes fled the country to go to Italy. And she tries to tie all of this to a larger conspiracy involving the Southern Poverty Law Center. As we talked about earlier this week, the DOJ filed an indictment that laid out allegations of financial misconduct, things like misuse of donor funds, fraud, and money being funneled through different channels tied to individuals and groups that were then used to reinforce the very narratives the ESPLC pushes publicly. They were basically funding the extremism they covered. The key point is this: the indictment names specific individuals and outlines specific financial relationships. It is not vague. It is not speculative. It is structured around identifiable actors. And needless to say, no podcasters, including Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, are anywhere on that list. There is zero evidence in that indictment that they were being funded by the SPLC. That claim is completely fabricated. But Loomer takes that fabrication and builds on top of it, layering implication on top of implication, suggesting coordination, suggesting intent, and ultimately constructing the image of some kind of covert operation that is about to be exposed. Thus, Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes have to flee the country because they're in legal trouble, according to Laura, who then goes on to tie Nick Fuentes and Candace to the Pope, implying that because they're in Italy, they must be coordinating with the Vatican, tying that into this broader woke Pope narrative because he criticized the war in Iran. So what starts as a false premise about the SPLC quickly expands into a full-blown conspiracy framework, one built entirely on correlation, assumption, and narrative stitching, and not a single bit of evidence. Now, this all ties in to this broader narrative about the Pope being woke, primarily because the Pope has criticized the war in Iran. And in this current political climate where there's the expectation of unconditional support for Israel, criticizing war or even just questioning the war in Iran and our motives for getting entangled there gets you labeled. If not anti-Semitic, then apparently woke right. So what Loomer does is take that framework and escalate it into a full-blown guilt by association without a single piece of substantiated evidence to back her claim. This isn't journalism, by the way. There's no analysis here. This is just speculation dressed up as certainty. It's National Enquirer level narrative construction. No facts, no verification, just ad hominem attacks and correlations turned into accusations. And then she uses all of that to fabricate an incendiary claim saying the woke right is an unholy alliance between Islamists and Catholics. Notice what she's doing there. She's taking the term woke right, which had already been floating around from people like James Lindsay, and deliberately twisting it into woke right to invoke Nazism. It's not subtle. It's a direct attempt to associate Catholics, particularly those in the America First space, with something as extreme and universally condemned as the Nazi regime. Now, think about what that implies for a second. The use of woke right is what introduces the Nazi comparison. It's a deliberate attempt to frame Catholics, particularly those critical of Israel, as something akin to a fascist threat. The unholy alliance with Islamists then escalates that framing even further, suggesting not just ideological deviance, but active alignment. And the justification for that leap is largely rooted in how the Pope was conducting himself publicly, spreading a message that has an emphasis on interfaith coexistence while traveling through Africa, Turkey, and other Muslim-majority regions. And in those contexts, he has made statements calling for a reduction in fear toward Islam, at times describing it as a region of peace in the context of coexistence, and encouraging cooperation between Christians and Muslims on issues like social stability, justice, and shared moral concerns. The Pope is also engaged in symbolic acts of respect during these visits, entering mosques, removing his shoes, and walking barefoot in certain settings as part of diplomatic and religious outreach. And what Loomer and others are doing is taking the Pope's actions, stripping them of their context, and using them to construct this narrative that the Pope, and by extension, all Catholics, are aligned with Islamic extremists. That leap is what allows them to frame this so-called woke right, where the earlier woke right label gets escalated into something meant to signal Nazism, all built on selective reinterpretation of this narrative and stitching all these unrelated elements together rather than providing a fair reading of intent and doctrine. Now, obviously, if you want to take a bad faith position like Laura and isolate the Pope's statements, you can spin them into something they're not. But in full context, the Pope is not making theological concessions. He is promoting coexistence. At the same time, this is the same Pope who has condemned same-sex unions, reaffirmed traditional church teachings, and even told migrants to remain in their home countries and work to improve them. These aren't woke positions. These are consistent with Catholic doctrine. The issue is that his role is not to serve a nation state. He is not beholden to Israel or the United States or any political bloc for that matter. He is beholden to the church and to God. And that independence is precisely what creates friction in a political environment that increasingly demands ideological alignment or be ostracized. Now, stepping back, there's also a broader geopolitical layer here that just can't be ignored. There has been a massive amount of rhetoric, some of it very clearly amplified by pro-Israel interests, framing Islam as a monolithic threat. And to be clear, Islamic extremism is real. There are jihadist elements that have committed horrific acts across the world. That is undeniable. But What is also undeniable is that this rhetoric often expands beyond extremists and paints nearly 2 billion people with the same brush, which is why it's convenient that while Israel is engaged in a genocide in Gaza, they would have their proxies, their media proxies, run with this narrative that all Muslims are evil. But the reality is, those two situations are not mutually exclusive. Islamic extremism can be evil, and Israel's actions can also be evil. But the current narrative environment often tries to force you into choosing one lens while completely ignoring the other. And that's not in the public interest. It's not intellectually honest. There are millions of Muslims who are peaceful, who contribute to society, who are not trying to impose Sharia law or wage jihad against everyone they come across. There are Muslim business owners, professionals, families, people integrated into Western societies. There are even historical contributions from mathematics to science that have reshaped the modern world. The same applies to Jews. Yes, there are Jews in the same situation who largely contribute to society, who aren't warmongering genocidal freaks like Netanyahu. And recognizing those things does not excuse extremism or being labeled an anti-Semite for trying to be reasonable. All this does is just contextualize reality. And to put it bluntly, the sole responsibility for dealing with the extremist elements in their faiths ultimately falls with the leadership in those faiths, be it the Islamic leadership structures themselves, be it with Jewish religious leaders, Israeli government leaders. But again, that nuance gets erased when the goal is to construct a simple, emotionally charged narrative. Now, all that being said, what Loomer is doing represents the extreme edge of this Catholic versus Israel dialectic that's playing out, but she's not alone. There are softer versions of the same rhetoric circulating throughout the cultural and political space, primarily on the internet. You see it in ongoing discussions where Jewish figures like Loomer attempt to reinterpret or challenge core Christian doctrines, particularly the new covenant established by Christ and articulated by Paul. That doctrine, which holds to the old covenant, is fulfilled in Christ, is now being reframed by Zionists as replacement theology, as if it's some kind of moral failing rather than a foundational pillar of Christian belief. Now, we see this dialectic playing out very clearly in the response to a viral clip of Carrie Prejean Bowler on Tucker Carlson's podcast, where she discusses Catholic theology, specifically the New Covenant and the idea that Christ fulfilled the Old Covenant, a core teaching rooted in the writings of St. Paul. As that clip has gained traction, you start seeing figures like Rabbi Shmuley and his daughter step in and respond directly to it, attempting to push back and effectively tell Christians what their theology should be, framed as a defense of Jewish doctrine and identity and the Israeli state by consequence. And that right there is the broader issue. This isn't just a disagreement. It's about who holds supreme authority over theology, who gets to define truth, what counts as acceptable belief in America, and where the lines are drawn in a shifting political coalition that is attempting to justify the unconditional support of the state of Israel. And to put it very clearly, the Zionists are attempting to delegitimize an entire religious Catholic tradition, millennia-old Catholic tradition, by associating it with extremism, reframing its doctrines as dangerous and isolating it within the broader right-wing movement. And if you've studied American history, this should sound familiar. It echoes the rhetoric of the know-nothings who cast Catholics as foreign threats with divided loyalties. That sentiment never disappeared. It just went dormant, I guess. And now, in this new geopolitical context, it's resurfacing with updated language and new alliances. So when you see Catholics being labeled as part of the woke Reich aligned with Islamists, you're not just having the displeasure of witnessing a bad take, you're seeing the surface of a much deeper conflict, one that blends theology, politics, identity, and power. And it's only going to become more visible from here. Anyway, all that being said, let's look at that clip from Rabbi Shmuley's daughter responding to Carrie Prejean Bowler.
We are the new Israel. That's what the church teaches. We are the fulfillment of the old Israel. The old was completely done. There is the new covenant now. Those who are in Christ. That is the new people of God. We are the new Israel. The land means nothing. They believe that they will rebuild that third temple. They're going to bring in the animal sacrifices again.
Carrie Prejean Bowler literally sends a shiver down my spine. She freaks me out so much that I had to show you this video because I want you to understand that we are in the middle of some really weird spiritual war where Jews are not allowed to exist at all. We can't even have our spiritual right as God's chosen people. Guys, there's someone else who replaced us. We are no longer connected to God.
What?
There's a new Israel. There's a new
absolutely not
chosen
what she
people. How many times does the Bible, the Torah, have to say that God doesn't break a covenant for Carrie Prejean Bowler to get it? And I know that what bothers these people like Carrie the most is that they know it too. I know that they look at the Jewish people and they know everything about us is miraculous. You just can't deny it. We really are chosen. And we have to step into that. And if we don't know who we are and take our spot as the chosen nation and fulfill that role and understand what that is, what that means, then other people will tell us who we are instead.
Everything she said here is objectively off. I don't know any other way to describe it, but notice how she barely even engages with any real theological backing. She mentions the Torah, sure, but then immediately pivots into this emotional identity-based appeal. It's not even an argument, it's a declaration. And for all the people like James Lindsay who are running around for the last few years calling Catholics identitarians, I would encourage you to step back and observe this moment carefully and maybe apply that same standard consistently, because what you're seeing here is pure identity assertion. She says, we are chosen, therefore we are right. Now look, you can believe whatever you want, okay? We live in America. You have the freedom to believe whatever you want here. That's not the issue. The issue is when you step into theological claims about Christianity while rejecting its core premise in order to teach Catholics about their own faith. The Catholic Church is not beholden to your interpretation of Scripture, and the reason for that is very simple. You reject the divinity of Christ. That's the foundational divide. That's not a secondary disagreement. That's the entire framework. So if you reject Christ, you also reject the fulfillment of the law. And that's where the misunderstanding begins, because Christ didn't break the covenant as she claims. That's the category error here. Christ fulfilled it. That's the word that's being missed. Fulfillment is not destruction. Fulfillment is completion. Every prophecy, every law of Moses fulfilled. And once something is fulfilled, it doesn't continue in the same form. It transitions. That's what a new covenant is. So when she says God doesn't break a covenant, she's actually reinforcing the Christian position without realizing it. The covenant wasn't broken, it was completed. And because it was completed, a new covenant was established through Christ. And those who are in Christ become the new people of God, the new Israel. That's not fringe theology. That's baseline, mainline Christianity. And that's a doctrine that's been upheld for over 1,000 years. Now, let's go even further, because she indirectly invokes this idea of replacement, what's often called replacement theology, as if Christians are claiming to swap one group for another. We're trying to replace the Jews, but that framing is flawed from the start. There's nothing being replaced in the way she's describing. What you actually have is fulfillment and transformation. And here's where it gets even more important, because the form of Judaism that she practices, that exists today, is not the same form that existed at the time of Christ. The Judaism that Christ engaged with was temple-based, sacrificial, priestly. That system no longer exists. There are no animal sacrifices. In fact, there's no temple to sacrifice animals in. What exists now is rabbinical Judaism, largely shaped by Talmudic interpretation and later developments. So when you appeal strictly to the Torah as if nothing changed, you're ignoring the fact that the entire structure surrounding Judaism has already changed for many years. Even concepts like the Noahide laws that are observed by Orthodox Jews are not directly laid out in the Torah in the way they're often presented. That's straight from the Talmud. They come later from rabbinical tradition. So the argument ends up being internally inconsistent, appealing to an unchanged Torah while operating within a framework that has already evolved beyond it. Now, beyond the theological layer, there's also a psychological and cultural layer to what she's saying here. This idea of chosenness is being framed in a way that turns it into a kind of inherent superiority, like a participation trophy you're born with. That's what it sounds like. But that's a misunderstanding of what chosenness actually means in a biblical context. It's not about superiority, it's about responsibility. And when it gets framed as superiority, it drifts into something else entirely, something closer to ethnic or spiritual elitism. And that's where the critique really comes in, because Christianity teaches something very different, that all people are equal under God, that salvation is not tied to ethnicity, but to Christ. It's not a political idea. That's a theological one. And it's also one of the foundational ideas that has shaped Western civilization and this country from its inception. Just read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and their affirmation of natural rights and God's providence. Now, historically, there's another layer here that people don't talk about enough. The phrasing around the rejection of Christ ties into what's known as the doctrine of Jewish witness, associated with figures like St. Augustine. The idea was that Jewish communities would continue to exist, not eradicated, but as a kind of living, visible testimony within society. And in that framework, Christians do, in a manner or sorts, affirm the specialness of Jews, not in terms of superiority, but in terms of role. Their continued presence allows others to observe in real time the theological consequences of rejecting Christ, and serves as an ongoing witness to the truth claims of Christianity. This isn't framed as something to celebrate or weaponize, but as a theological reality tied to the fulfillment, covenant, and history. Now, back to the cultural, political context, there's also this weird attempt by Zionists to tie the modern state of Israel directly back to the ancient state of Israel in a theological, cultural, and political sense. But from a Christian perspective, that connection is not as straightforward as the Zionists attempt to present. The Second Temple was destroyed, just as Christ prophesied. The Jewish people were dispersed, and within Christian theology, that dispersion is understood as part of the broader consequence of rejecting Christ and the old covenant being fulfilled. So when people try to merge modern geopolitics with ancient covenantal theology as if they're identical, they're collapsing two different categories, which brings us to the bigger picture here. What you're seeing in this clip is not a true theological disagreement. It's a clash of frameworks, one pushed by Rabbi Shmuley's daughter, which is rooted in identity and continuity, and the other explained by Carrie Preaching Bowler, rooted in fulfillment and transformation through Christ. And when those frameworks collide in the modern political space, especially in a media ecosystem where there are several actors that are being paid by foreign governments to support American foreign policy and justify wars on behalf of a genocidal state, it doesn't all just stay theological. It becomes cultural and then political. And that's why this conversation is getting louder, because it's not just about who's right theologically. It's about who gets to define truth, authority, and legitimacy in a moment in time where you can't even make a joke about Netanyahu without getting arrested, where Catholics are literally being told that we cannot believe millennia-old doctrine and teaching because all of a sudden we're now being anti-Semitic and attempting to erase Jewish identities. I think we can all see how problematic in a country where, according to Thomas Paine in Common Sense, one of our greatest values is our freedom of religion, you have this dynamic where this foreign actor, this Israeli state, as well as many other foreign actors, to be fair, are trying to influence discourse here, and in this case specifically, impose theological definitions on the majority Christian population of this country in order to keep them subservient to this genocidal cause. And look, all that being said, the level of control that Israel has culturally and politically in this country should never be underestimated, and this is coming straight out of the mouths of folks who, according to themselves, didn't even think about Israel before they got involved in politics. And the person saying that is Randy Fine out in Florida.
It's one of the funny things about being me. I always get accused of being a dual citizen. I'd never even been to Israel until I was in my 30s. And none of my family is actually from there. But you know, I've been there a lot, actually, mostly since I got elected, because of all of the work that I've done, really to try to make America safe for Jews. Because I will tell you this, the pernicious threat of anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It only starts with the Jews. It doesn't end with the Jews. Every society in recorded history that has become anti-Semitic has ultimately collapsed. And it's not because the Jews did it. It's because it's a brain rot. It's what Tim's talking about. Why this obsession? By the way, they believe all kinds of other crazy things. None of it makes any sense.
This is ridiculous. But more importantly, it's very telling. Number one, Randy Fine openly admits he never even really cared about Israel, never even had any meaningful connection to it until he got into Congress. And then suddenly, once he gains power, Israel becomes one of his central priorities. He starts taking regular trips, doing work tied to it, making it a core part of his political identity. That timing is not subtle, folks. That's not organic. That's a pattern. And anyone paying attention should be asking the obvious question: why does that shift happen the moment someone enters federal office? Why does this issue, which had no personal relevance to Randy Fine before, suddenly become a defining focus of his work as a representative of the people of Florida? And then look at the rhetorical framing he uses to justify all of it. It's the same formula every time: an appeal to fear, to moral urgency, to this idea that anti-Semitism is some overwhelming, ever-present threat in American society. He calls it a canary in the coal mine. It says every society that becomes anti-Semitic collapses, and frames it as this kind of civilizational brain rot. But the problem is this framing is wildly overstated compared to reality. I've had debates about this before. In fact, at AmFest, the average American is not walking around obsessed with Jewish people. They're worried about rent, inflation, groceries, gas prices, their job, their family. These hyper-politicized narratives exist primarily in elite circles, online discourse, and among political junkies who consume this stuff daily. Most Americans couldn't care less whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, atheist, whatever it is. They've got real problems to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean anti-Semitism doesn't exist, by the way. Of course it does, but the way it's being presented here as this defining existential threat shaping American life in the present is inflated. And what that inflation does is create a moral shield. It creates a moral panic to support Randy and his Israel cause that he just became familiar with. Because once you establish that everything is under threat, then any criticism can be reframed as part of that threat. And that's where the historical pattern really starts to shape up. And we see this because thinkers like Hilaire Belloc were already pointing this out over a century ago. In his 1922 book, The Jews, Belloc argued that the term anti-Semitism was being expanded beyond its original meaning. He made a distinction between a true anti-Semite, someone with a fixed, irrational hatred of Jews, and someone who was simply engaging in political and social critique. His concern was that the term was being stretched into a catch-all label applied to anyone who even acknowledged tension, influence, or difference. And his argument was that this expansion doesn't eliminate hostility. It actually fuels it because it shuts down honest discussion and creates resentment. G.K. Chesterton echoed similar concerns. He mocked the idea that simply discussing Jewish influence or supporting Zionism in a particular way could automatically be categorized as anti-Semitic. Both of them were essentially making the same point. When a term like anti-Semitism becomes too broad, it stops being precise and starts being political. It becomes a tool, a cudgel, not just a descriptor. And it's ironic that this point was made over 100 years ago, and we're seeing the same playbook still play out. And it's very evidently still playing out in this clip, because this isn't even about protecting Jewish people. It's about establishing a boundary around what can and cannot be questioned, that being the state of Israel. And that brings us to the broader issue of influence and policy. Criticizing the state of Israel does not make you anti-Semitic. Questioning why American politicians suddenly prioritize a foreign country after entering office is not anti-Semitic. Asking why hundreds of millions, by some estimates billions of dollars, flow through lobbying efforts tied to Israel, PACs tied to Israel, and political donations from people like Miriam Edelson, who is tied to Israel, is not anti-Semitic. That is basic civic responsibility. That is what citizens are supposed to do in a functioning republic. And to be clear, this isn't uniquely even about Israel. This same standard applies across the board. I'm critical of money coming in from Qatar, from China, from Russia. I'm critical of sending American taxpayer money to Ukraine, to Somalia, to Israel, to Argentina, to the UAE. I don't want our money going anywhere overseas when Americans are struggling here at home. And I don't want foreign influence shaping our political system either, period. That's what America First actually means. It doesn't mean hostility toward any group or identity. It doesn't mean hatred. It means prioritizing American citizens, American interests, and American sovereignty above all else, above any other nation, no matter how big the paycheck. And when you see politicians like Randy Fine shift their priorities the moment that he enters office, when you see narratives inflated to shut down criticism. And when you see labels expanded to control discourse, you're not just looking at a policy disagreement. You're looking at a system that is trying to manage perception of a foreign nation. A foreign nation that, by the way, according to a recently released State Department memo, is the reason we engaged in a war with Iran. According to the Department of State memo titled Operation Epic Fury and International Law, which reads, including most recently on March 10th, the United States is engaged in this conflict at the request of and in the collective self-defense of its Israeli ally, as well as in the exercise of the United States' own inherent right of self-defense. Someone explained to me how firing a preemptive strike on a sovereign nation that hadn't attacked us qualifies as self-defense, especially when you consider statements made by Mike Johnson, Tom Cotton, and Marco Rubio himself, all indicating that the strike was preemptive because we were anticipating that Israel would strike, and that would put our positions in the region at risk. So how is that self-defense? We're preemptively self-defending against something that hasn't happened yet based on what another country may do? That's not self-defense. That's an attack. Let's just be real. But as always, with the likes of Ben Shapiro, it's never enough. He is now calling the U.S. a bad friend to Israel. Please say the quiet part even louder for us. I don't think some people heard in the back.
Would you describe the U.S. as a good ally right now?
I think that the U.S. has always been a bit of an unreliable ally, shall we say.
That has to be a joke, right? The U.S. is an unreliable ally to Israel, really? That's how you want to describe it after everything America has done for years, after our country spent billions of dollars every single year, supplied weapons, backed Israel diplomatically on the world stage, and aligned major parts of our foreign policy around Israeli security concerns? That's unreliable? If that's the standard, then what exactly qualifies as reliable, complete and total submission? And this is what people are reacting to, because there's a growing disconnect between what Americans are told and what they actually see, what we're expected to do on behalf of this foreign nation. When someone like Ben Shapiro says the United States has been an unreliable ally, it forces a very basic question. What more do you want, bro? We're not talking about minor support. We're talking about billions in aid, consistent military cooperation, intelligence sharing, repeated political cover in international institutions. That's not neutrality. That's not distance. That's straight up full alignment, as close as you can get for two nations, especially one that offers so little back to America. Now, you can have a legitimate debate about alliances. You can argue that supporting Israel is strategically important in the region for America, it stabilizes the region, that it serves U.S. interests. That's a fair argument to make. But calling the U.S. unreliable in that context flips reality on its head entirely. It reframes one of the closest alliances in modern geopolitics as somehow insufficient. And that framing matters because it shifts expectations. It turns a strong alliance into a baseline, and anything less than absolute agreement is betrayal. How is that even reasonable to claim as an American, a political commentator in American politics? It literally inadvertently plays into the dual loyalty stereotype.
I believe the Trump administration did not handle the narrative well and let this perception that the tail was wagging the dog with respect to the comments you made earlier that Israel somehow had bullied the president into the war. Are you worried, as I am, that Israel is going to lose even more support in the U.S. as the perception is we've been dragged into this war by Israel?
From my position, if Israel is safer and the United States is safer and the poll numbers are worse for the foreseeable future, then that is a deal that is well worth making.
Well, off the rip, this question is absolutely off. As we just saw, and this is from the State Department memo we just looked at, published on their website. This isn't speculation. This is just from a few days ago, stating that we engaged in this conflict at the request of and in the framework of collective self-defense with our Israeli allies. So how can you turn around and ask whether the perception is that we've been dragged into a war by Israel? That's not just perception. That's the stated justification coming from our own government. You don't get to call it a conspiracy when it's literally written into the policy language. And then you get the response from Ben Shapiro saying if Israel is safer, that's a deal well worth making. Think about what that actually means, folks. A deal well worth making for who? For Americans, for the people who are funding this, whose sons and daughters are potentially put at risk, their lives at risk, whose economy absorbs the cost Or is it a deal worth making for Israel, regardless of what it costs the United States? Because those are not the same calculation, and pretending they are is where the problem starts. And let's just be honest for a second. It's evident at this point that Ben Shapiro is an Israel absolutist. Israel comes ahead of everything for him, so it seems. Anything for the state of Israel, and that's his position. Fine, you can have this position. It's a free country, but don't dress that up as some sort of America first argument or any sort of alignment with American policy. Don't pretend that sacrificing American interests, stability, or even the perception of neutrality on the global stage is somehow inherently aligned with what's best for this country, because it's not obvious, and it's certainly not something most Americans have agreed to when they voted for their representatives. Now, what makes this even more insane is that Ben is willing to say this publicly, knowing full well the broader implications. You're talking about potentially sacrificing the image of Israelis and Jews here in the United States, people who have nothing to do with foreign policy decisions, by tying them so closely to U.S. military action and geopolitical conflicts. You're collapsing the distinction between a foreign government and an entire group of people living here, and that has real consequences. And in a great sense, it's reckless. Which leads to the following obvious question. What's the end game here? Does Ben plan on even living in America long term? Is he building life elsewhere? Because when you start framing U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts as a deal well worth making, primarily in terms of another country's safety, people are going to start asking questions where your actual loyalties lie, not in some conspiratorial sense, of course, but in a very practical, policy-driven sense. What are you optimizing for, Ben? All that being said, let's zoom out, because this isn't just about one comment. This is about a broader shift happening in how Americans view foreign policy. For decades, we've been told that these alliances are mutually beneficial, that they serve our national interests, that they make us safer. But when statements like Ben's come out, where the benefit is framed almost entirely in terms of another nation's security, it breaks that illusion and forces people to really reevaluate the premise. And that's why this conversation is only getting louder, as it should, because more and more Americans are starting to ask a very simple question. When we say allies, do we mean partnership or do we mean obligation? Because if it's the latter, then we need to be honest about that. And if the answer is that American involvement in war is justified primarily by the safety of another country, then we're no longer talking about an alliance. We're talking about a hierarchy of priorities. And people are starting to notice where they fall in that hierarchy. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.